The copy machine on the third floor of Millhaven Regional School District's administrative building had been broken for 11 days, and nobody had fixed it because nobody wanted to be the one who filed the request. Because filing the request meant your name was on a piece of paper somewhere. And in this building, having your name on pieces of paper had a way of becoming a problem. Audrey Sloane knew this. She'd worked in the district's compliance office for 6 years, long enough to understand how paper moved and how people disappeared, and she kept her head down the way everyone kept their heads down, and she told herself that was fine, that was just how institutions worked, and most days she almost believed it. She was at her desk at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning when she found the folder. It wasn't hidden exactly. It was sitting in a filing cabinet she'd been asked to reorganize, third drawer, behind a hanging folder labeled Grants. Archived, which was a category that nobody ever looked in because archived grants were finished grants, and finished grants were nobody's problem anymore. Someone had put it there on purpose. She understood that later. Someone had put it there because they needed it to exist, somewhere that wasn't their own office, somewhere with a little distance, somewhere that offered plausible removal if things went wrong. Inside the folder were 4 years of scholarship disbursement records for the Millhaven Academic Excellence Fund. The fund was real. It had been established by a city council member named Harold Cobb 12 years ago, a public-private partnership, donations from local businesses, a genuine effort to send kids from low-income families to college who otherwise wouldn't have gone. Audrey knew about the fund the way she knew about most things in the district. It was background, it was institutional furniture. It was the kind of thing you mentioned in board meeting minutes without looking at it too hard. She looked at it now. The numbers took her about 8 minutes to understand and about 4 more minutes to accept as real. Over the course of 4 academic years, 61 scholarship recipients had been listed as enrolled in partner universities. The disbursements had gone through. The acknowledgement letters had gone through. The annual report to the City Council had noted improved graduation rates and family economic outcomes. Superintendent Gerald Harmon had presented that report himself, standing at a podium in the council chambers with photographs of smiling students projected on the screen behind him. 38 of those students did not exist. She checked 3 times. She pulled the enrollment verification files from the district's shared drive, cross-referenced the student IDs, ran the social security numbers through the federal verification portal she had access to, because her job was compliance, and compliance sometimes required federal portals. 38 names. 38 sets of records that were internally consistent, plausible, beautifully constructed, and attached to no actual human being who had ever walked into a classroom anywhere. The money had gone somewhere. It had not gone to college. Audrey sat very still at her desk for a while. The building was quiet. The copy machine on the 3rd floor was still broken. Through the window, she could see the parking lot filling up slowly, cars arriving in the particular order she'd memorized without meaning to. Harmon's black Suburban always first, then the assistant superintendent's Audi, then the department heads, then everyone else. She thought about what to do. She was 32 years old. She had a lease on an apartment she liked, and a car payment she was managing, and a job that had health insurance, and 2 weeks of vacation, and a 401k that was starting to feel like something. She had a mother in Tucson who called on Sundays and didn't need to hear about this. She had a life that was not large but was hers, and it was held together by the paycheck that came from this building. And she sat at her desk and looked at the folder and thought about 38 names that didn't exist, and an unknown number of kids who should have existed in those records and hadn't, kids who had applied for something they needed and been passed over while the money went somewhere else. She made copies of everything. She put the copies in her bag. She put the original folder back exactly where she'd found it, behind Grants, archived, same angle, same depth in the drawer. Then she went to her desk and started her day like nothing had happened, because she needed to think, and she couldn't think, while also looking like she was thinking. The person she trusted most in the building was a woman named Dr. Phyllis Okafor, who ran the district's federal programs office 2 floors up and had been in education for 30 years, and had the particular quality of stillness that comes from having seen most things and survived most of them. Audrey went up at lunch, closed the door, and put 3 pages of the copied records on Okafor's desk without saying anything first. Okafor read them. She read them again. She picked up her reading glasses and put them on and read a 3rd time. Then she said, "How far back does this go?" 4 years that I can confirm, Audrey said. "Maybe more." "Where did you find this?" Audrey told her. Okafor set the pages down with the particular precision of someone controlling her hands. "You understand what you're looking at?" "Yes, and you understand what happens to people who look at it." "I'm starting to." Okafor was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone's phone rang in the hallway and then stopped. "You need to go to the State Education Department's Inspector General," she said. Not internally, not HR, not the board, not anyone in this building. External, federal if possible. You go inside this institution with this, it disappears and so do you. Audrey nodded. She had known this somewhere underneath the part of her that had been hoping for a different answer. Don't use your work email, Okafor said. Don't use your work phone. Don't tell anyone else in this building. Not yet. She paused. I'm going to pretend you didn't show me this. I know. I'm not saying that to protect myself. I know, Audrey said again. You're saying it, so you can still be here when I need someone who knows. Okafor looked at her for a long moment. Go home tonight. Think about whether you're willing to do this. Think about what it will cost, then decide. Audrey drove home. She sat in her apartment and ate dinner she didn't taste and thought about 38 names. She thought about the kids who had applied, real kids, actual teenagers sitting at kitchen tables, filling out forms because someone had told them there was money available for people like them, people who worked hard and didn't have much and wanted something more than what they'd started with. She thought about those kids getting a letter saying they hadn't been selected, or getting no letter at all, just silence where a future was supposed to be. She thought about Superintendent Harmon at that podium, the photographs projected behind him, his voice carrying the particular warmth of a man accepting credit for something he had hollowed out. She decided. The next 4 weeks were the longest of her life. She contacted the State Office of Inspector General through a personal email account she created for the purpose. She documented everything, the records, the cross-references, the federal verification results, a timeline she built from disbursement dates and audit logs, and her own memory of things she'd seen over the years that hadn't seemed important until now. She worked at her kitchen table after 10 p.m. with the door locked and the blinds down because she was being careful, because Okafor had told her to be careful, because she understood now why the folder had been put in a filing cabinet behind Grant's, archived by someone who was also trying to be careful and had run out of road. At work, she was exactly who she had always been. She answered emails. She attended meetings. She reorganized the filing cabinet. She'd been asked to, she had to finish it, and she did it slowly and thoroughly, and with no visible change in her expression when she got to that drawer again. She had lunch with colleagues and talked about the school board election, and a new Thai place that had opened downtown, and whether the copy machine was ever going to get fixed. It was not going to get fixed. She knew because she'd learned carefully, without asking direct questions, that the copy machine repair request was connected in the district's budget system to a vendor account that had last been audited in the same fiscal year as 2 of the fraudulent scholarship disbursements. She didn't know what that meant exactly. She put it in the documentation anyway. In the 5th week, things began to move in ways she couldn't control. Someone, she never found out who, told Deputy Superintendent Craig Lennon that a compliance officer had been accessing federal verification portals outside of normal workflow. Lennon was Harmon's deputy and had been for 9 years, and Audrey did not know his level of involvement, but she knew he was the kind of man who reported sideways before he reported up, who understood instinctively that the most dangerous thing in an institution is not wrongdoing, but the discovery of wrongdoing. Lennon called her into his office on a Wednesday afternoon. It was a short meeting. He said there had been some questions about her use of district compliance resources for what appeared to be non-standard verification activity, and he wanted to understand her workflow better. He said it the way people say things when what they're doing is not asking a question but delivering a message. Audrey said her workflow was standard, and she was happy to document it. He said he was sure she was, and he'd be reviewing some of her recent activity with the district's IT audit team, standard procedure, nothing to worry about. She went back to her desk and sent everything to the OIG contact she'd been working with, every document, every copy. The timeline, the vendor account connection, the notes she'd kept about the folder's location and her own verification process. She sent it in 3 separate encrypted attachments from her personal phone on her personal data, sitting in the parking lot at 4:47 p.m. with the October wind rocking her car. Then she went back inside and worked until 5 o'clock, because leaving early would have been a different kind of signal. They put her on administrative leave the following Monday. Lennon delivered the notice himself. He came to her desk at 8:20 a.m. with a woman from HR named Ms. Poole, whose expression was carefully neutral in the way of someone who has delivered these notices before and has learned to remove herself from the room while still technically being in it. The notice cited a pending review of compliance protocol irregularities. It was 1 page. It was very clean. It offered her 30 days of paid leave while the review was conducted, which was framed as a courtesy but functioned as a removal. She was asked to surrender her badge and her building access card before she left. She did not say anything that she would regret. She had prepared for this moment by deciding in advance what she would and would not say, and she kept to that decision, and she collected her personal items from her desk in a tote bag she'd brought for exactly this purpose. She'd brought it that morning because she'd felt it coming the way weather comes. A change in pressure, and she walked out of the building at 8:34 a.m. with her bag and her coat and her keys, and she sat in her car for 6 minutes without starting the engine. She thought 38 names. She started the engine and drove home. The thing about being put on administrative leave is that it looks, from the outside, like guilt. Your colleagues hear about it, and their expressions do a complicated thing where they're trying to seem neutral, but they're also stepping back slightly, recalibrating how they know you, deciding whether you're someone they want to be associated with during whatever this turns out to be. The people who like you feel sorry for you. The people who don't like you feel vindicated. The people in the middle, which is most people, wait to see which way it goes. Audrey knew all of this, and she let it happen because there was nothing else to do. She called her mother on Sunday and said work was complicated right now. She went for long walks in the morning when the neighborhood was quiet. She cooked things that took time, actual meals with multiple steps, because having steps to follow gave her hours of structure, and structure kept the fear manageable. The fear was specific. She wasn't afraid of losing the job, exactly. She had already lost the job, some version of the job. The version where she walked in and sat at her desk and was part of something that made sense. What she was afraid of was losing without having accomplished anything. Going through all of this, and the folder going back into the drawer, and the name staying gone, and Harmon presenting next year's report with new photographs behind him, while she tried to explain a gap in her employment history to people who would never fully believe her explanation. She didn't tell anyone that. She walked in the mornings and cooked in the evenings, and she waited. The OIG investigation had been active for 3 weeks before her leave began. She knew this from her contact, an investigator named Agent Doyle, who communicated with her through a secure channel, and who had the quality of someone who was being very careful not to tell her things she didn't need to know, while also making sure she understood that what she'd sent them was real, and that it was being taken seriously. He said real and seriously once each, which in her experience of careful people meant he meant both words precisely and literally. What she didn't know was that the investigation had expanded. She found out the way she found out most things in those weeks, obliquely, from peripheral information. A former district employee she knew slightly, a man named Davis who'd left the district 3 years ago and had always seemed to have complicated feelings about Harmon, sent her a text that said only, "Things are moving." She stared at it for a long time and texted back, "Okay." Davis didn't respond further, which she took as meaning what it appeared to mean, which was that things were moving and she didn't need details right now. What was moving was this: the OIG investigation had intersected with a separate federal inquiry into how the Millhaven Academic Excellence Fund was structured. The fund had city council involvement and a private donor component and a fiscal sponsor relationship with a nonprofit. And that structure meant that when the fraud existed inside it, the fraud was potentially a federal matter and not just a state matter, and federal matters moved differently. Federal matters had different resources and different reach and different ways of touching people who had kept their distance from a filing cabinet for 4 years. On the 31st day of her administrative leave, Audrey got a call from Agent Doyle asking if she was available to speak with some additional people the following morning. She said yes. He said there would be 2 investigators from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and she might want to have an attorney present. She said she would arrange that. He said she was not the subject of the investigation. She said she knew. He paused very briefly and then said, "You did the right thing," which was the first thing he'd said that wasn't strictly informational, and she didn't respond right away because she didn't have a response for that. Because doing the right thing was what you were supposed to do. And she didn't feel she needed to be told she'd done it, but she also understood he wasn't saying it to compliment her. He was saying it because he'd been in rooms with people who'd done the right thing and understood that those people sometimes needed to hear it said plainly. "Thank you," she said. 8 a.m., he said. "We'll come to you." They came to her apartment. 3 of them, Doyle, a woman named Special Agent Garber, and a man named Special Agent Holt, who was tall and asked very few questions but wrote down a great deal. The meeting lasted 2.5 hours. They asked her to walk through everything from the beginning: her original discovery, her verification process, her reasoning for going to the OIG, what had happened with Lennon, the leave notice, the timeline. Garber asked most of the questions. She was precise and patient and covered the same ground from multiple angles, without making it feel like she was doubting Audrey, more like she was building something that needed to be structurally sound from every direction. At the end, Garber said, "You're aware there's a board meeting this Friday?" Audrey said she was aware. "We'll be there," Garber said. It wasn't a question and it wasn't an explanation. It was just information, offered in the way of someone who wanted her to know that the thing she'd set in motion would reach its destination on a specific timeline. Audrey said, "Okay." After they left, she stood in her kitchen for a while. She made coffee she didn't drink. She looked out the window at the October light on the street, the leaves down now, the trees bare and clear against the sky. She thought about the folder in the drawer. She thought about the kids who'd gotten silence where a future was supposed to be. She thought, okay, what's next? The Millhaven Regional School District board meetings were held in the district administrative building on the second floor, in a room with fluorescent lighting and rows of plastic chairs, and a long table at the front where the board members sat and looked slightly uncomfortable, as board members at public meetings tend to look. The meetings were usually attended by 12 to 20 people. A few committed parents, some staff members with grievances, a reporter from the local paper who covered education and always looked faintly apologetic about it, and whoever was currently angry about the proposed middle school redistricting, which was a dispute of such longevity that Audrey suspected it would outlast several geological epochs. She arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the third row. She hadn't been there since her leave began. She was still technically on administrative leave, which meant she was technically not a district employee for these purposes, which meant she was attending as a member of the public, which was something she had confirmed with her attorney and which the district could not prevent. She sat in the third row in her coat, which she did not take off, and she watched the room fill. Harmon came in at 5 minutes to 7. He was 61, a large man who carried his size with the comfort of someone who'd never had to explain himself to anyone significantly bigger, and he had the quality she'd noticed over 6 years of people who are accustomed to being the most important person in any given room. He took his seat at the center of the long table and arranged his papers, and spoke to the board member on his left, without looking toward the public seating, which was also characteristic, that particular lack of looking that was too consistent to be incidental. Lennon came in 2 minutes later and sat in the row behind the board table. Audrey watched Harmon not look at her. At 7:03, 3 people she did not recognize came through the side door and took positions along the wall. 2 of them she identified immediately, Garber and Holt from her apartment meeting, different clothes, same quality of stillness. The third she didn't know. Harmon looked at them. He looked away. He looked at them again, and she watched from 30 feet the moment when he understood. He was a man who had managed things for a long time. He was a man who had calculated distance, who had understood that the folder needed to be somewhere with a little remove, who had made decisions about what he could afford to have directly attached to himself and what needed to live elsewhere. He had done all of this carefully, and she watched him sit behind the long table in the fluorescent light and understand that careful had not been enough. He didn't run. She'd wondered in some private part of herself what a person did in that moment, whether they stood up and left, made a scene, created something that would have to be managed. He didn't. He sat with it. He straightened his papers again, a small, precise movement, and he sat. The board chair called the meeting to order. The proceedings that followed were not like anything on the agenda. Agent Garber and the third person, who identified himself as a federal prosecutor from the Eastern District, presented a summary of findings that took 22 minutes and was received in the kind of silence that is not empty but dense, packed with the particular pressure of a room full of people understanding simultaneously that something is over. The board members had not been forewarned. Audrey could see that in the way they held themselves, the stillness that is not calm but shock. 3 of them, she noted, showed the additional expression of people processing whether they personally needed to be worried, which was information of a different kind. Harmon was placed under arrest at 7:31 p.m. Lennon was escorted from the room by Holt at the same time, not under arrest. Not yet. The prosecutor had indicated that his situation was ongoing, but not under his own recognizance either. He passed within 10 feet of where Audrey was sitting. He didn't look at her, and she didn't look away. The room took a long time to settle. The board chair, a woman named Dr. Pacheco, whom Audrey had always found competent, and who seemed, in this moment, to be drawing on reserves of composure that the role of school board chair does not normally require, managed the transition with something that Audrey would later describe as grace. Pacheco asked the remaining staff to stay. She asked the public members who needed to leave to please do so quietly. She said the district's operations would continue without interruption to students and families, and that she would be issuing a comprehensive communication by the end of the following business day. She said, "Before we close, I want to acknowledge that this investigation was initiated by a district employee who had the integrity to report what she found through appropriate channels at considerable personal risk. That employee's administrative leave is rescinded, effective immediately." Audrey hadn't expected that. She sat with it. Dr. Pacheco looked at her directly. "If you're willing, I'd like to speak with you after this meeting." She said she was willing. They sat in Pacheco's car in the parking lot because there was nowhere private in the building at that moment, with people still moving through it in the particular way of a space where something seismic has just happened. Pacheco turned the heat on. They sat in the warmth for a moment without talking. Pacheco said, "What you did required more than most people would have managed." Audrey thought about the folder. She thought about the hours she'd spent sitting at her desk that first morning deciding whether to make the copies. She thought about driving home that night and eating dinner she didn't taste and thinking about kids who got silence where a future should have been. The fund needs to be restructured, Audrey said. The oversight gaps that made this possible, the lack of external verification on disbursements, the single-point approval process, those aren't going to fix themselves with personnel changes. You can replace Harmon and still have a system that will do this again. Pacheco was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this. I've had a lot of time. Are you interested in being part of fixing it? Audrey looked out through the windshield at the parking lot, the lights, her own car in the third row where she'd parked it. She thought about the filing cabinet. She thought about the copies machine on the third floor that nobody had fixed because nobody wanted their name on a piece of paper. She thought about what it would mean to stay in this place and try to change the actual conditions, not just replace the people at the top, but alter the structure so that the next person who found something wrong had somewhere to go with it that didn't require 30 days of leave and an FBI visit to her apartment. She thought about 38 names. Yes, she said. She drove home with the heater running and the highway quiet and both hands steady on the wheel. She had a phone call to return. Her attorney had texted 3 times during the board meeting, and she had a message from Dr. Okafor that said only "I heard" with a single understated punctuation mark that conveyed in Okafor's particular way everything. She had a call to make to her mother in Tucson that would be longer than the usual Sunday call. She had work to do. Not the work of surviving something or outlasting something or waiting for something to resolve. Actual work. The kind that needed doing, because no one else was going to do it. The kind that would take time and fight and careful documentation, and probably more than a few evenings at the kitchen table with the door locked and the blinds down. Except now the work was different. Now she would be changing something instead of just enduring it. The scholarship fund had disbursed real money to real kids once. That was why it had existed. That was why people had donated to it, and why a city council member had stood at a podium 12 years ago and said, "This is what we're doing for this community." The money was recoverable, Agent Doyle had told her. Not all of it, not easily, but some. And the fund itself could be reconstructed with actual oversight, actual verification, actual accountability, the kind of administrative structure that was unglamorous and detailed and essential, the kind of work she was exactly qualified to do. 38 names that didn't exist, there would be 38 real ones.